Hello and welcome to Sales Gambit. I'm your host, Ashish, CEO of Convin, a conversation intelligence platform for the sales teams. In today's episode of Sales Gambit, we have Mark Evans, CRO and founder at SalesKit and Standard Sales Company. Mark helps sales leader, entrepreneurs, and SaaS companies scale their lead generation engine and accelerate closing rates. Welcome to Sales Gambit, Mark. I'm super excited to host you today.
Thank you so much, Ashish. I am so honored to be here and really appreciate the opportunity.
Sure. So in today's episode of Sales Gambit, Mark, we'll deeply discuss about how to create a sales playbook for a SaaS startup serving to mid-market segment in US or other countries for that matter. But before we jump right into that topic, right, I would love to hear from you on how do you get into sales, a bit about your sales journey so that audience can relate more to you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, Ashish, I'll try to keep the condensed version. I know you don't like 6-hour podcast episodes. So really my experience started because my parents are entrepreneurs and they started a business when I was very young. They put everything on the line when it came to their financial, as well as moving myself and my 3 sisters from one location in the United States to another. So they really put it all on the line, and that really resonated with me and that really stuck with me. So as a young kid, I was helping them in the business, whether it was sweeping floors or delivering orders. And essentially, I started to get more and more exposure to business. I knew that I had always wanted to be in business and be a businessman, and so sales seemed like a natural fit. I had some success in the corporate side of America and helped teams scale pretty fastly, one being a staffing firm that went from just 2 or 3 million to about 10 million over the span of a few years. And then another was a company where we went from about 5 salespeople to 75 salespeople in about 14 months or so. So from these experiences, I was really looking at, all right, what did I want to do next? I was at this inflection point in my career, and I knew I always wanted to start my own business. And so a few companies noticed what I had done previously and said, hey, would you do that for us? And ultimately, my consulting journey and sales career took another step in being my own entrepreneur and business owner.
Makes sense. No, that's a great one. A lot of time I've heard people, saying that they got into sales by chance, but in your case, it seems like it was predefined. I mean, you were always onto that path of, going into sales as a business.
Yeah, I was one of those rare kids when we went around the circle in like kindergarten or first grade, and they asked you, what did you want to be? I did not want astronaut. I knew that the food was not going to be great on some sort of space shuttle. I didn't want to be a fireman. The only other option I wanted to do was be a garbage man and ride on the back of trucks, or be in business and be in sales. And so I chose the latter.
Makes sense. Now, diving deep into the topic, right, very quickly. We want to talk about creating a sales playbook for SaaS startup, right? Serving to, let's say, mid-market segment, all of that. The first basic question that comes to my mind is like, why is it even important to think about creating a playbook? And what long-term impact does it have for a company that is able to figure out their playbook as quickly as possible? If you can highlight these 2 things, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think that most organizations right now, one of the number one things that I hear from a lot of companies is, all right, how do we replicate our sales success? And so many companies don't even know what's leading to sales success. So when I say a sales playbook, I don't just mean, hey, this is where all of your best emails should be, or this is where a couple of talking points should be. A playbook in essence is essentially the secret sauce, if you will, or the recipe to how a sales rep goes from zero, right, from off the streets to being a stranger to the company to being one of the top reps. And companies, especially today, that can condense that timeline, that can take a rep starting up from, let's say traditionally it took a year to onboard, to 6 months or 3 months or even less. Those are the companies that are going to be in a unique situation to truly not just have success, but to ultimately dominate their market. And I look at a sales playbook as one one of the key ingredients for this, because if you can condense that time frame, if you can get more sales reps up and producing quicker and faster, you have a unlimited competitor advantage. And that doesn't even go into taking account all of the different research that shows that if a sales playbook is properly executed or sales training is properly executed, that there's a higher retention rate for sales reps, and there's a higher turnaround rate and onboarding rate and things like that nature. So I really think that it consolidates into a couple of key areas that either companies have it or they're going to suffer long term.
Very interesting. So can I say that a sales playbook is more from a long-term perspective, where you are not just looking at the immediate short-term picture, but you are trying to figure out how to create an engine where you can input certain things, and then you can expect certain outputs, and that engine can be a sales playbook in there. Can I say
Essentially,
that?
yeah, how we deliver it is in a sales playbook, but other companies deliver it via sales training or onboarding. What we like to do is we call it a sales playbook, right? We like to hand that over to a new rep and say, hey, here's what you're going to need to know. Here is your source of truth. Here is, the ground level information that you're going to need to be successful in this industry. And so many organizations are letting sales reps come in and try to figure it out on their own, or they're trying to just do training one-on-one, right, which doesn't always scale appropriately or properly. And so what we work with companies is to shift from just letting sales reps come in and maybe determine their culture, determine their selling style, to being very prescriptive and saying, this is exactly how we are going to sell. This is exactly what we're going to say in these instances. Here's our exact sales process.
Understood. A second question that people might want to ask, here is that, does it even make sense to have a sales playbook for a startup? I mean, a startup can be happy. I mean, you don't have enough people doing everything. You don't have enough people documenting everything. It's more about experimentation, right?
Yeah.
So, the first question would be: is it really? Does it make sense to have something like this for a startup? If not, or if yes, at what stage do the startups start to think about creating a playbook for themselves?
Yeah, well, I'm a big believer that from the stages of 0 to really like 1 million for a startup, what they're essentially trying to do is figure out, all right, what do we have here, right? What is our value proposition? And ultimately, like, how do we sell it, right? Because I think a lot of entrepreneurs and companies, they fail not because they can't build products, identify markets, or even essentially like price their products effectively and properly. But really, why most startups fail is because they can't sell their product and run out of money before they gain traction. So I really think in that 0 to 1, 0 to 3, 0 to 5 stage, right, the main goal of that entrepreneur should be trying to figure out, how do we sell this product? And as soon as they start seeing some patterns, that's when I would start replicating it. And we call it a sales playbook, but let's call it a sales process, right? We want to recreate that recipe. We want to recreate that result as many times as possible. So if they don't have it, that's where we got to start moving towards, right? Essentially figuring out those repeatable steps of what is our messaging? How are we going to go out and get leads, and how are we going to do that on a repeatable basis so that every week, every month, we've got a certain predefined number of leads? Then what's our closing mechanism, right? How do we take someone from awareness of our product, moving them through our funnel in a very prescriptive way so that we are in control of the sale versus a prospect just deciding when they're going to purchase or not, moving them through that process so that ultimately we've got that repeatable sales engine that you had mentioned before. And I really think that should be the main goal for most entrepreneurs, definitely from 0 to 1, but sometimes even 0 to 3, 0 to 5.
Makes sense. So, for example, let's say if there's a startup having the founders doing the core salesperson, or a VP of sales performing as a VP of sales there, right? A head of CRO, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there are just the account executives in between and a couple of SDRs. Would you say that is that the right stage to start thinking about it, creating a proper sales playbook?
I would say even
It should
before.
happen?
Yeah, it should be before, right? If you're going to hire on SDRs and account managers, they should know what you're going to sell, right? They should know what the value proposition is, what the sales messaging is. Basically, think of it as this: there's all these tasks that one needs to do off the call, right? And that's, the daily admin and things like that. But then there's everything that they need to do on the call, right? And that's really where I would recommend an entrepreneur to spend 80% of their time, right? Or spend 20% of their time and get 80 results results is really understanding what has to happen when they get on that call, because one of your first hires should be someone who can help you book appointments. As an entrepreneur or CEO during those first stages, right, you're going to be the main deal closer. You should be the main deal closer, right, if you can. And the next hire should be one of those individuals that can naturally book as many appointments and fill up your sales schedule, because no one's going to be able to sell your product better than you are. So I really recommend starting with an SDR. I recommend in hiring 2. That way we have some competition, and that way then if you're training 1, you can train 2, right? Life happens to people and they fall out. So starting with that
Yeah.
SDR, then all those SDR appointments that they're booking should naturally go to the CEO. CEO is going to sell them. And as you grow and as you scale, the next spot would be migrating one of those SDRs or promoting one of those SDRs into more of an account manager role. That's essentially the couple month cycle that you could have there.
Understood. We talk about the playbook for startups, and for startups, everything is generally hard. Imagine a startup selling to a mid-market segment for the companies where there are multiple decision makers, multiple hierarchies of selling. How do you suggest them to think about creating a playbook? For SMBs, it can be easier because it can be self-driven, it can be self-sustainable. But for mid-market segment, definitely it has to go deeper than that. So how do you suggest a startup, someone who's handling a head of sales in a startup? Lol.
Well, Shishi, you were cutting out a little bit there, but I think from what I understand the question to be is like really number one, how an enterprise or how a more mid-market company versus an SMB could operate and start creating those sales processes and systems. Because I think that overall, right, creating that sales playbook is essentially about finding what makes you successful and putting that in a recipe, right, putting that in a play, as we call it, that can be repeated time and time again. So for those companies, I would really start looking at, all right, what is the message and offering? This is really the first spot that you can look at, right? And really, like, what's the messaging? What's the sales argument? That means that messaging needs to be validated and the offer needs to be repeatable, right? A winning sales argument is really what separates those nice to have products and services that you know that there's something there, but since the sales argument is weak or is a little lukewarm, right, it's not that rock star. You don't have that amazing results. You don't have that incredible type of success and traction because that messaging and that offer isn't quite right. So I call that first stage really like picking the lock. What you got to do during that process is really understanding what it is, what are the problems that your customer is having, what are the problems or jobs that need to be solved, and then how does your product interact with that? And one of the best ways to do that, honestly, is just by having a ton of conversations, whether you're at the SMB level, whether you're at the enterprise level. Where you're going to find this information out is by directly talking to your customers. So that's why I put a lot of emphasis on establishing a repeatable lead generation system, by establishing SDRs with high metrics and high KPIs, because those more conversations you're going to have, essentially the more you're going to figure out what the problem is that your prospect's having and how you and your product can solve them.
Understood. And let's say to go about creating a playbook, what are the things that I should look at including in the playbook?
Yeah, great question. So like I mentioned before, you have the on the call and the off the call activities. So start there. Then when you go on the call, right, what are all those steps? Like what are you going to say? How are you going to follow up, right? How are you going to book the next appointment? Things like that. So you can start detailing that. Then you can take it one step further and even break up your day, right? So what are you going to do at the beginning of the day, or what do you want someone to do on the beginning of the day? Midday usually should be on the phone. And then what are you going to do end of day, right? So using this framework, I'm able to start thinking and putting myself in this role, right? If I'm an SDR, what I'm going to do in the day is I'm going to check my sales numbers from yesterday. I'm going to attend the daily meeting. And then I'm going to go on the call, right? So I'm going to go on the phone. So then I'm going to need this. So start looking at it as either on the phone or off the phone, right? And then once you're on the phone, think of all those elements of like when you're in your sales call motion. And then you should, from there, that's where you can start ticking things off, right? Start collecting either those assets, building those scripts, finding those email follow-up sequences.
Makes sense. Very quick question here, Mark. It sounds like that whatever you told me sounds like following a routine for a salesperson, right? Like a salesperson, their daily trying to get to productivity. Does it generally work if a salesperson is following their routine as a part of a sales playbook?
Well, I think ultimately, right, most salespeople are afraid of a word called discipline. Yet on that same flip side, some of the
Yeah.
most, right, yeah, and you maybe have seen it as well, right? But yet some of the most successful salespeople and companies and sales managers that I've seen are very disciplined in their approach on how they go about business, right? So many salespeople won't
Mhm.
do the hard work that it takes to make sales very easy, right? Oftentimes what makes sales hard is by not doing the day-to-day activities that we know are going to lead to success. And then 30, 60, 90 days later, that compounds because we didn't do the right activities, we didn't do the right number of activities, and that results in a low pipeline, right? Or that results in not having enough conversations. All those systematic things and symptoms that could have all been solved if we just would have taken a disciplined approach. So I'm a huge believer in taking a disciplined approach when it comes to sales. And in my experience, almost all the top salespeople, organizations, companies, departments, managers, you name them, they take a very disciplined approach as well.
Understood. While creating a sales playbook, do you think a focus has to be given on sales methodology? Like what sales methodology the company follows or wants to follow? Anything around that, or you should let the representatives decide on their own?
Yeah, I would almost look at it as having like an MVP of sales methodology. I think you need to have something, right? How do you open a conversation? How do you ask questions? And as a founder, as a CEO, as an entrepreneur, that's where you can put and impart some of your DNA onto that, right? What kind of sales organization are we going to have? Is it going to be Wolf of Wall Street,
Mhm.
right, where we are, smiling and dialing and making deals, or is it more of a consultative approach? So partly of your product, part of just the general kind of what you want to build as far as a company are going to have some elements to that. But I think what's far more important, because there's so many good sales methodologies out there, right? There's hundreds, if not thousands. Many of them are good. Many of them have very similar structure to it. I think the
Yeah.
sales methodology that's executed is far better than the sales methodology that's talked about, tried out, but never really truly executed on. I would much rather take the MVP model that is truly executed on versus trying to build something out that isn't essentially executed on.
Okay, so you basically take what have been done till now and take that as a benchmark to at least go ahead and then improve on top of it. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. I mean, take it like how you would do software development, right? You would do a
Yeah.
sprint, right? You would start with something, you would iterate on it, you would see what works, what doesn't, you would validate it, and then you would try again. Same thing should be happening with your messaging, with your offer, with your sales process, right? Try something, iterate on it, and then go back to the drawing board, right? And keep going those loops. So you have this MVP type of sales culture, this MVP type of sales process and sales playbook.
Understood. Understood. Makes sense. In general, for building a sales, it takes a lot of time and effort, right? From anyone's side. Even if, let's say, a founder is doing it versus a VP of sales would be doing it at some early stage startups, right? It takes a lot of time and effort. How do you suggest management people to align everyone else in the company to be able to create a playbook? Like, how do you effectively put up a playbook together is basically what I want to understand from you.
How do you effectively do it? Yeah, so it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of expertise too. That's not just something that you can roll out of bed and just snap your fingers and gain access to that. It takes a lot of time in the sales saddle, I would say, right? It takes a lot of time being in these conversations to help build out. How you can execute on it, right, is by just getting a start. So starting with that framework, right? Start thinking through your day. And what I love working with founders on is by asking them a simple question of what's one question you've had to answer more than twice, right? So I'm a big believer, don't ever answer that
Mhm.
question twice, right? Put it and start building out that sales playbook. That's an easy one to get started with. Things like your glossary, keywords, terms, that's another easy one. Chances are you've got an internal glossary, right? Words that your team uses or that are unique to your industry, that if that was in the hands of someone in sales, right, either from the beginning or as you're building this playbook out, would be very, very helpful starting from there. And then your salespeople are going to tell you what they need, right? As they're in conversations, as they're trying to progress deals forwards, they're going to let you know, hey, I ran into this objection. How would we handle this? And that's where we go. And that's where we iterate on the sales process, the sales message, and the sales playbook. And then we ultimately build a greater sales playbook from that. So they're going to give you this feedback on it, but they got to be in the mix. You as a founder, as a CEO, as an entrepreneur, need to be in that mix. You need to be in that sales process.
Understood. when you talk about this whole sales playbook as a process, right? Uh, a lot of deals would not get closed during the quarter, right? And if you're not improving on them continuously, it will not. I mean, the whole system will not improve at some point after some point in time. So, how do
Mhm.
you see post sales or post, I mean, lost deal analysis or post sale analysis as a critical part of the sales playbook? One, do you see that it is a critical part? Second, if yes, how exactly should it be done so that people continue improving on this?
Yeah, so I definitely think that it is important. Would I give you the exact recipe for how that works? That's gonna be different for different
Right.
industries as well as different like team environments. I think just a standard, what I really like doing after the end of whether it's a new market launch, new product launch. I was in one last week for a client where we entered a new market, and what we did is a after action review. And one of the key elements that we did during this was to really look at what worked well, what didn't work well, and what was a magic wand, right? What would you change about that experience if you had any budget, time, or money? And so what we did was this simple exercise. It only took about 90 minutes, but was very valuable. And if you're an enterprise client, this is something that you could definitely do. If you're selling a B2C offer that's smaller, maybe you wouldn't do this for every deal, but you could look at your entire sales process and simply, right, all you got to do is hand out a bunch of post-it notes with markers, and for 10 minutes on the clock, have your team write down everything that's working well, either in their sales process or what worked really well in their last offer, right? Take 10 minutes, everybody puts it up on the board, then you consolidate and start looking at some of the trends. Do the same thing with what didn't work well, right? And then do the same thing with your magic wand. And from there, you're going to start seeing trends, right? Either how we built rapport was great, how we visited them, we did a great job in discovery, what didn't work well. Maybe it was the pitch, right? Maybe it was the offer, maybe it wasn't us responding to the pricing. And the magic wand, right? What would you do if time, budget, all that stuff didn't matter? Well, maybe you would travel there more. Maybe you would go and meet them to deliver the final presentation, whatever that's going to be, right? Um, really start understanding those elements and then use that in your feedback loop, right? Use that as you're iterating on your sales process. Very simple exercise. Very few companies take a retrospective of that, but the elements that you're going to find are so, so critical and can really help improve your sales process.
As you pointed out, like very few companies do this retrospective exercise, right? And make the learnings a part of sales playbook. Why do you think is that so? Is it very hard to do, or is it just that people don't see this as a valuable stuff?
Well, I don't think it's hard to do because we do this in a technical format, right? We often do this with a new product launch from a product perspective, right? The product team will get together and say, this is what worked well, or the
Yeah.
engineering team will do that. We just don't apply that same level to sales because oftentimes we're not thinking of sales as a system. We're thinking of sales as this creative enterprise in which these individuals who like talking to people that are maybe charismatic and enthusiastic, they go out, they do some black magic, and all of a sudden we have a prospect or we have a lead that's in the pipeline. It's not what sales is, right? Sales can be just as disciplined and systematic as any engineering element or as any product design element. And if you take the time to really archetype and architect out what you want your sales process to be, you can have certain metrics, you can have certain scorecards, you can have certain things in place, boundaries in place, so that they're operating just like a product team or just like an engineering team.
Fair point. No, that's a very fair point. A lot of startups generally now sell cross border as well, right? They would either be selling to, I mean, outside US or in Europe, or Europe selling to US. And does sales playbook has any, I mean, would the context change across borders?
Yeah, that's a great question and very timely for me as well. I was actually just this morning on a conversation with about 30 individuals from Romania, now living in southwestern Florida. I didn't have to travel over there, but I did get to speak to this room of entrepreneurs and salespeople over in Romania. And what I'm always fascinated by, because I've got clients in over 40-ish countries or so, what I'm always fascinated by is the fact that while the country may change, right, while how some of the core elements of sales, or while some of the not core elements, but while some of sales may change, essentially we're all driven by some of the same things, right? We're all driven by certain core fundamentals that we can use. And so while some of the tactics may certainly change, right? For example, when we're working with companies from Europe that are coming to the United States, and this is one of our largest markets, we help companies that are European, that have a good product and want to launch in the United States. Well, all it comes down to, they have a great product. Sometimes it just comes down to the messaging, right? Sometimes it just comes down to a more aggressive approach when it comes to messaging, especially for the American market. But at the end of the day, right, solving a problem for a founder in Germany, if you can do that, you can also probably do that. You can solve a problem for a founder in America. So some of those elements are there. It's just a matter of tailoring your audience a little bit.
So I think that if someone is doing cross-border sales, they should really focus on the audience in general, and a lot of the basics should remain same about creating a playbook. Is that so?
Yeah. That's as far as I understood. She cut out a little bit there, but yeah, as far as I understood that sounds correct.
A company is trying to sell to other country outside their whole region, right? Uh, is it advisable to look for an SDR team which is on ground in that specific country, or is it advisable that can start with anything or any their own country, setting them, and later on think about expanding globally and building an SDR team in other country?
Yeah, well, I think it all comes down to a matter of budget, right? If you're an organization that can afford to have an on-the-ground team, there's going to be nuances that team is going to pick up from a language, from a syntax perspective, that just cannot go unmatched, even if you have an excellent, fluent speaker of that language, right? However, right, most countries have a budget in mind. Most companies need to be conscious of that. So I am totally in favor of starting with an outsourced team, right? Whether it's from the States or whether it's from other great countries, that wherever it's going to be, right? Starting there, starting to call in. Now, with some, especially European countries and some other countries, Asian countries, you're going to have a language barrier that's just going to make it very difficult. So you're going to have to start with an on-the-ground team. But for others, though, right? You certainly can start with a team and based in one country calling on another. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do, especially if you're going into a new market, is just trying to find that MVP, right? That MVP sales playbook, right? That MVP sales cycle. And that's the really important part. And the only way you can do that is by getting reps. So I would much rather start with a team that's starting to get those early learning lessons than it would be to wait a year, 2 years, however long it's going to be, try to build this team up and get those learning. Remember, all with an MVP, we're just trying to get feedback a lot faster.
Makes sense. I'm in line with what you're saying in terms of how quickly you can get the feedback, because that's what matters actually, right? Second last question that I have with you, Mark, is that how do you measure if the sales is performing? Is there any KPIs you should be measuring regularly and see what needs to change, or you need to revamp the complete playbook? How do you do those things?
Yeah, absolutely. So great question. So with every company that we work with, we look at a dashboard. And so I think that there's always, I'm a big believer that every company and every person should have a scorecard. And from that scorecard, everybody should be ranked based on that scorecard. So when I look at sales, it's one of the greatest parts about the sales profession. It's also one of the most difficult ones, is that sales has a scorecard. And so what I mean by that is that everybody has a number, right? If you're an accountant, how do you know you're a good accountant? Well, I guess if you don't get audited, or here in the States, if you don't get in trouble with the IRS, sure, I guess then you're a good accountant. But with sales, since we keep score, it's such a valuable position because we know exactly who's a good salesperson and who's not. There's no wiggle room, right? If you're the number one salesperson at a company of 500 salespeople, you are a good salesperson. There is irrefutable proof that you are the top dog, that you are the best. So that's a really valuable one. So I believe very, very strongly that all salespeople have to have a scorecard. They have to have a minimum amount of activity and results that it takes for them to stay employed at that organization. KPIs are great, but having at least a bare minimum. right? Start at least with a bare minimum. They have to get 3 appointments a week, right? For them to actually do their job. We wouldn't let someone in production, right, just simply like not do their job, right? Like, well, did you take any like widgets and take them from here to here? Like, well, no, you didn't. But in sales, we're like, oh, okay, well, you didn't get any results, right? And we let them go on their merry way. We wouldn't accept that from any other role inside of our organization. So scorecard, super important. What I really like looking at just from an SDR perspective, or even from a closer perspective or account manager perspective, right? How many calls are they scheduled for? How many appointments are they booking every day? Of those calls and appointments, what's their show up rate? So that's really important to me. Once they show up, how many of those prospects actually get an offer, and an offer either for another meeting, right? To maybe meet with an account manager or the CEO, however your sales process is set up, or an offer to the actual product, to purchase the product or to start a trial, right? I want to know how many offers are actually being made. That helps me understand how good is our targeting, how good is the actual audience that we're trying to target there. Also, I want to know how much revenue is collected on each and every single product every single day, so that I can start looking at some trends there. I want to know how much cash is collected, right? I want to know how many, we talked about offers, we talked about closing commitment, we talked about products. So those are kind of the ones I really like looking at to start with, and then from there you can customize it to your own needs.
If I can understand correctly, you'll use this as a benchmark of to see things in order, not where you feel that things are not running in order. Then you'll try to deep dive and improve the overall playbook. Is that correct understanding?
Yeah, absolutely, right? If I know that a rep is having let's say five scheduled calls every single day, but only one of them is showing up, well, I know that we have, a couple of issues. Number one, maybe we don't have enough reminders in our sequence to remind some of the appointments. Or number two, maybe just our appointment setting mechanism is not strong enough. We're not setting a firm enough appointment with that prospect, so they feel like they can bounce from it. So there's little elements from there. Scorecard really just shows me what the symptoms are, right? And so once I can see those symptoms from those results, then I can dive in and take a closer look and actually see what's either wrong or incorrect with our sales process, and iterate on that.
Amazing. I had one last question, Mark, that I want to get your feedback on. Is that what are some resources or material that you recommend people, and I would say mostly management, to be able to create great sales playbooks?
Yeah. Well, there's not a ton of books out there on how to create a great sales playbook. So I think what I would really start with, I would love to point you in a direction or two. I've got a book out there that talks a little bit about how to build out these sales systems. You can find it on Amazon. Just Google my name. It's called Raise Your Standards, the definitive guide to building 7-figure sales. So I think that's a start. What I would also look at as well is just spend time with your salespeople. That's where you're going to get all your information. That's where you're going to see either where there's struggle or where there's other gaps. So that's where I would really want to start with, is just spending more time with your salespeople. That's where a lot of it can be solved.
Sure, makes sense. But that's really helpful. It sounds like, if you start spending time with your salespeople, you'll understanding how they think about it, how they're responding to certain things. The keep improving on those things.
You're totally right.
It's great. Yeah, we are very happy to have you on the podcast, Mark. So such info, and I'm sure the audience will love this. Thank you again for coming on Sales.
Thank you for having me, Shisha. I really appreciate it. It's a great conversation.
I fell where my demons dwell, my own little